They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes it's also colder. When Luke Harris stood beneath the heavy sky that morning, rain sliding off the brim of his worn hat, he believed he was burying his father. He didn't know he was also burying the last piece of his old life. Menam, the church bells tolled through the valley, slow and hollow. A few townsfolk watched from under umbrellas, whispering about how Charles Harris had been the kind of man who built everything with his hands, his land, his home, even his family's pride. And now that pride lay in the coffin too. Luke kept his head low. His brother Grant was already talking with the lawyer, his sister Evelyn pretending to cry for the crowd. But Luke knew better. He saw how quickly Grant's eyes shifted from grief to greed. He noticed how Evelyn checked her reflection in the hearse window, not her father's grave. When the rain stopped, the wind carried the sound of a single shovel of dirt hitting the coffin lid. That hollow thud would stay with Luke forever. Later that day, in a dim office filled with dust and silence, they gathered for the reading of the will. Luke expected little but not betrayal. When the lawyer unfolded the paper, his voice trembled. Charles Harris had divided everything, land, machinery, savings, unevenly. The largest shares went to Grant and Evelyn. Luke would inherit a small maintenance fund and a single acre of barren soil behind the barn. Grant smiled. Evelyn pretended to be surprised. Luke stayed still, every heartbeat slow and deliberate. Then came the final blow. Evelyn slid a few papers across the table. Just routine adjustments, she said. To make things easier for all of us, he signed them because family meant trust. That signature would cost him everything, but it would also become the signature of their doom. Because years later, when the wind whispered through those same acres, people would remember the man they betrayed and how he came back for everything they took. The morning after the funeral, the sky hung low, as if mourning with him. The farmhouse windows reflected the same emptiness Luke felt inside. He had spent 33 years believing family meant safety. Now he realized it only meant leverage. Within days, the truth surfaced. The routine adjustments he'd signed were not minor documents. They were a legal transfer of his ownership rights, a quiet, calculated theft wrapped in smiles and condolences. Grant wasted no time. He moved the tractors, changed the locks, even repainted the mailbox. When Luke arrived to collect his tools from the workshop, he found a padlock on the door and a polite note pinned above it. "We'll handle everything from here." No signature. They didn't even have the courage for that. Luke walked back down the gravel path in silence. Every crunch beneath his boots echoed the weight of betrayal. The local bank confirmed the nightmare. His father's accounts had been restructured. His name was no longer listed. Evelyn and Grant now owned everything. Land, funds, even the farmhouse where Luke was born. He had been erased. He rented a small room above a gas station on the edge of town. The air smelled of gasoline and loneliness. Nights were long, the kind where silence feels like punishment. He replayed every moment, the signatures, the smiles, the empty promises. When he called Evelyn, she didn't answer. When he tried Grant's number, it went straight to voicemail. Days blurred into weeks. The only thing that changed was the depth of his anger. One evening, he drove past the old farm. The gates were closed, the Harris name freshly painted, but the house looked unfamiliar, too polished, too perfect, as if it already belonged to someone else. Through the open barn door, he saw Evelyn laughing with a real estate agent. She wore their father's gold watch, the one she'd promised to bury with him. Luke parked far down the road and watched from the shadows until night swallowed the fields. That was when something inside him hardened forever. He didn't shout, he didn't break things. He simply understood that nothing in life was fair unless a man made it so. A week later, Luke packed his few belongings into an old pickup and drove away before dawn. No goodbyes. No explanations, just a quiet exit through the fog. People in town assumed he'd gone to start over. But the truth was simpler. He was starting elsewhere entirely years past without a trace, and Grant prospered. Grant prospered. They converted the farm into a vineyard, turning the soil their father once nurtured into luxury wine. Articles praised the Harris legacy, celebrating them as visionaries of the region. Neither mentioned Luke. In interviews, they spoke as if they had always been the only children. But sometimes, when reporters asked about family, Evelyn's hand trembled ever so slightly. Grant would change the subject quickly, his jaw tightening for just a second. Deep down, they knew the past never forgets its debts. Meanwhile, across several states, rumors occasionally surfaced. A man working under a different name, quiet, precise, rebuilding old machines. He never stayed long, paid in cash. Left before sunrise, Luke Harris was teaching himself how to disappear and how to rebuild from nothing. In the stillness of motel rooms, he studied business law. He watched documentaries about corporate fraud, learned how shell companies worked, how trust funds could hide ownership. Each night he wrote notes in a small leather journal, plans, connections, calculations. He didn't drink, he didn't date, he didn't dream, he prepared, he understood that revenge wasn't a moment, it was a craft, and craftsmen take their time. By his 5th year away, Luke owned a small auto repair franchise under a new identity, Lucas Gray. He invested quietly, never drawing attention. Every dollar earned was a brick in the foundation of his return. He followed his siblings' progress from afar. Their growing debts, their new mansion, their interviews bragging about generational success. Success built on lies, each photo, each headline was fuel. He never forgot the sound of dirt hitting that coffin. He never forgot that gold watch glinting in the barn light. Hasid Baferch. And most of all, he never forgot his signature on those papers, his own hand forging his chains. So he began to forge keys instead. Keys made of patience, of knowledge, of quiet fury. Then, on the 10th anniversary of Charles Harris's death, a new corporation appeared in the region's business registry, Ironvale Estates, LLC. Its founder, Lucas Gray, publicly it was a real estate investment firm buying struggling vineyards. Privately, it was Luke's blueprint for reclamation. Within months, Ironvale bought its first property 20 miles from the Harris vineyard, then another and another. Each purchase surrounded his siblings like a tightening ring of land. He moved back under a new face. Leaner, tanned confidence, replacing the quiet boy they once crushed. When locals saw him, they assumed he was just another outsider chasing wine profits. No one looked close enough to recognize the ghost beneath the suit. Luke Harris was gone. Lucas Gray had arrived. That night, he drove to the hill overlooking his father's old fields. The vineyard lights shimmered below like scattered stars. He opened his journal, flipped to the first page, the one written in that gas station room years ago. It said only 4 words, they'll never see me. He smiled for the first time in a decade. And beneath that same sky that once wept over his father's grave, Luke Harris began to write the next chapter of the Harris legacy, one forged not in forgiveness but in fire. The night he wrote those 4 words, they'll never see me, Luke Harris felt something strange, not peace, not joy but clarity. It was as if the weight of 10 years finally shifted from his shoulders onto his purpose. For the first time since that rainy funeral, he wasn't drifting, he was steering. The next morning, Lucas Gray woke up before sunrise. He dressed in pressed clothes that didn't belong to the man he used to be. He spoke less, smiled politely, and listened to everyone. People remembered his manners, not his past, exactly as he intended. He rented an office on the outskirts of town, a place that looked harmless from the outside, just another business suite with blinds half drawn and a nameplate that meant nothing. Inside, maps covered the walls, property grids, survey charts, financial documents pinned with red thread connecting them like arteries. Every pin was a step closer to the heart of the Harris empire. The vineyard his siblings owned had grown wealthy, yes, but also reckless. Luke knew from public records that Evelyn had refinanced the estate 3 times in 7 years. Grant had taken loans against future harvests. The land looked prosperous, but it was bleeding quietly beneath the surface. He smiled at the thought. Sometimes, the best revenge doesn't require destruction, just pressure applied at the right vein until the heart gives out on its own. Months passed. Lucas Gray became a known name in the local business circle, the quiet investor who always delivered, never raised his voice, never asked unnecessary questions. He invested in irrigation firms, bottling plants, and storage facilities, everything the Harris vineyard relied on to survive, piece by piece. He was rebuilding the world around his siblings until every door they walked through would someday lead back to him. He kept his distance at first, no contact, no confrontation. He wanted them comfortable, unaware. But at night, in the silence of his study, Luke sometimes caught himself remembering his father's voice, rough, patient, always saying, "Son, don't ever plant something unless you're ready to wait for it to grow." 10 years ago, he hadn't understood. Now he did. Revenge was a crop too. One evening, a local newspaper published a feature on the new faces of Wine Valley. The front page showed Grant and Evelyn standing proudly beside the Harris Vineyard sign. They looked older, but arrogance had aged well on them. Grant's hairline had thinned. Evelyn's smile looked practiced, but both radiated the smugness of people who believed they'd won forever. Luke read every line carefully. The reporter mentioned their plans to expand into luxury real estate. That meant they would need investors, that meant they would need him, and when greed calls, betrayal follows. A week later, Ironvale Estates sent an inquiry to the Harris business office. just a friendly note, proposing a collaboration, new funding, modern technology, expansion into resort-style vineyard experiences. Grant's assistant replied within a day, meetings were arranged, signatures were exchanged. History, without knowing it, began to repeat itself. But before he could face them, Luke needed one thing: control of his emotions. So he visited the old town again. He parked far from sight and walked the familiar dirt road leading to the graveyard. The air smelled of damp leaves and earth. He stopped at his father's headstone, simple, weather-worn, half-covered by wild grass. He brushed the dirt away with his sleeve. The letters Charles Harris stared back, almost fading with time. Luke whispered softly, "You were right, Dad. I should have waited." The wind moved through the trees as if answering. He turned to leave but paused when he saw another grave a few rows down. Mary Harris, his mother long gone before any of this began. He stood there longer than he expected. Revenge had kept him alive, but grief had made him human. He needed both. When he returned to town, he was ready. The Harris siblings had no idea the meeting they scheduled with Dot. Lucas Gray would be the first step toward their unraveling. The conference room smelled of polished wood and expensive coffee. Evelyn sat near the window, her jewelry flashing under sunlight, her face calm but restless. Grant, heavier now, leaned back in his chair with forced confidence. Luke entered, every movement measured, every expression trained. He greeted them with professional warmth. They shook his hand, oblivious that they were touching the hand of the man they'd buried in their past. No one recognized him. 10 years and a different name had erased the traces of Luke Harris. Even his eyes, once soft and honest, now carried the kind of distance that makes people hesitate to stare too long. The meeting lasted an hour, contracts, numbers, percentages, all business. By the end, Grant was smiling, convinced he'd found the investor who would save them from growing debts. Evelyn, ever the charmer, even suggested a private tour of the vineyard. Luke accepted. Inside, he could almost hear his father's shovel hitting wood again, that hollow sound of burial. Only this time, it wasn't his grave being dug. That evening, as the sun lowered over the valley, Luke followed Grant and Evelyn through rows of vines heavy with fruit. They spoke proudly about profits, awards, upcoming shipments. He listened, nodded, pretended admiration. The golden light bathed everything in serenity, the illusion of family, of success. But to Luke, every leaf, every grape was stained by memory. This was the soil where his childhood ended. This was the land they'd stolen. When they stopped near the barn, once his workshop, he saw something that made his jaw tighten, the initials CH. Still carved into the beam, his father's mark. He hid his reaction behind a polite smile and said something meaningless about craftsmanship. They laughed, oblivious. In that moment, Luke realized revenge didn't always have to roar. Sometimes it could whisper softly enough that only guilt could hear it. Over the next months, Ironvale's partnership deepened. Luke arranged favorable deals for them, low interest rates, exclusive contracts, all while quietly making the Harris Vineyard reliant on his resources. Every success they celebrated was a string tied tighter to his hand. He learned their patterns, their weaknesses. Grant drank too much. Evelyn spent too freely. They trusted accountants more than instincts, and employees more than each other. It was beautiful, watching their greed become the rope they'd hang from. He hired a private investigator to dig into their history. The man returned with files thicker than expected, documents showing tax manipulation, falsified grant reports, unpaid workers. All the dirt he needed lay neatly arranged before him. He didn't act on it. Not yet. Revenge, like good wine, needed to breathe. One stormy night, as thunder rolled across the valley, Luke sat in his office, staring at the photos spread across his desk, the vineyard, the mansion, smiling at charity events. He poured himself a glass of wine, the same label they produced. He took one slow sip, then whispered, almost to himself, "It tastes like theft." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the maps pinned to his wall. Every red thread connecting to one central point, the Harris estate. The web was complete. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the storm, and thought, 10 years ago they took everything I had. Now every storm that touches this valley will carry my name. That night, a landslide on the hillside nearby destroyed one of the vineyard's irrigation channels, an accident, according to local news. Repairs would be costly, but luckily, Ironvale Estates offered assistance. Grant accepted instantly. The first real debt was created. From that day forward, Luke no longer saw his siblings as people. They were projects, intricate puzzles waiting to collapse from within. And as the storm clouds cleared the next morning, the valley bathed in golden light once more. No one noticed the man standing quietly on the ridge above. watching the vineyard below with eyes that no longer held mercy. Because in the game he was building, mercy had no inheritance. The storm outside hadn't stopped since that night, the night Evan lost everything. Every rumble of thunder felt like the world's cruel reminder of his downfall. He had been sleeping on a worn couch in his sister's old garage for weeks now, air heavy with gasoline and regret. But that night, as lightning illuminated the shadows through the cracked window, something inside him finally shifted. He had spent too long drowning in his pain. Now it was time to weaponize it. The first step was information, the kind that only a man like Evan could gather. He was a cybersecurity expert, one of the best in his firm before the betrayal. His skills weren't just about defending systems, he knew how to tear them apart piece by piece until the truth screamed through the circuits. But this time he wasn't chasing truth. He was creating a ghost, one that would haunt those who destroyed him. Evan powered on his dusty old laptop, its fan wheezing like an exhausted soul. A blue glow filled the room, reflecting off his tired eyes. He opened a folder marked Project Lazarus. Inside were tools he had built years ago for ethical hacking simulations, but now ethics had no place in his plans. "Lazarus," he whispered, typing commands into the console. "Let's raise something from the dead." Line after line of code streamed down his screen, a silent orchestra of vengeance. Within hours, he gained access to his old company's private server. Every security key, every backdoor, he had designed them himself. They had fired him, erased his name, but they couldn't erase his fingerprints from the architecture. And deep inside the company's system, hidden like a venomous snake, he left a new program, invisible, untraceable, a ghost in the wires. At first, the changes were small, emails disappearing, project files subtly altered, financial reports showing errors that no one could explain. Within a week, chaos began to stir inside the company. His former colleagues whispered rumors about data breaches and strange anomalies. The CFO blamed the IT team. The CEO panicked. And Amelia, the woman who once promised to stand by him, looked increasingly nervous during board meetings. Evan watched all of it unfold through a hidden backdoor feed. Her expressions, her frustration, her confusion, they were his entertainment now, but he wasn't satisfied yet. He wanted her to feel cornered, to feel what he had felt, powerless and humiliated. One night, Evan walked into a Archer Seethauer diner off the highway, a place where no one asked questions. The waitress poured him coffee as he spread out blueprints across the table. Old contacts from the dark web were already responding to his encrypted messages. He wasn't just planning cyber revenge anymore. He was planning something that would reach the real world, something that would make them believe their sins had come alive. He found out Amelia and Daniel had merged the company with a larger tech firm, using the stolen project he had created, the same one that had gotten him fired. They had sold his invention under Daniel's name, making millions. Evan stared at the screen, the headline glowing coldly. New security software revolutionizes financial protection systems. Daniel's smug face filled the article photo. Amelia stood beside him smiling, the kind of smile that once melted Evan's heart but now burned like acid. He exhaled slowly, whispering to himself, "You both built your empire on my blood. Now let's see how fast it crumbles." Over the next few weeks, Evan became a digital phantom. He created a network of fake investors and leaked information to rival firms. He planted fabricated data showing that Daniel's software, his software, had dangerous vulnerabilities. It started as rumors, but in the tech world, rumors spread faster than truth. When days, the company's stock began to fall. Investors pulled out, the board started. Amelia tried to hold things together, but she couldn't stop the rot, because the rot was invisible, living inside every line of code. And every line of code had Evan's signature buried deep within it. But revenge has a way of waking old wounds. Late one night, as Evan monitored the chaos from his garage, a memory replayed, uninvited, Amelia's voice, trembling the day before she betrayed him. "Evan, I need to tell you something. Daniel's offering me a position on the board. He says it's our chance to build something big. You'll be part of it too." He had believed her then, he'd even congratulated her. He didn't realize she was already gone, emotionally, spiritually, long before she walked out that door. That memory cut deep, so deep that even victory didn't feel like relief. Evan shut his laptop and stared into the dark. Revenge was supposed to make him feel alive again. But for a fleeting second he wondered, what if it just made him more like them? He clenched his fists. No, this wasn't over. He hadn't even reached the part they'd truly deserve. A week later, the local news broke the story. Ino Tech Vision Corp faces federal investigation over security breaches and data leaks. Daniel's company was collapsing. Amelia's name was now tied to corporate fraud. Reporters swarmed their offices, cameras flashing like vultures circling a dying animal. Evan watched from afar, sitting in his beat-up car across the street, the cold wind biting his face. For the first time in months he smiled, not out of joy but justice. Still, one thing bothered him. Groothuizen. They didn't know it was him. He wanted them to know, to feel his presence like a shadow breathing down their necks. That night, Amelia received an anonymous email, no subject line, just a single attachment, a photo of her and Daniel standing outside the company building taken from across the street. Beneath it, one sentence. "Yeah, you both look so proud. I wonder if he knows what you did to me." She froze. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the screen. Daniel was asleep upstairs, oblivious. She deleted the email instantly, but the damage was done. For the first time, she felt fear. And Evan, sitting in the darkness of his garage, whispered softly, "Now you remember me." Days later, Amelia started receiving more messages, fragments of conversations only she and Evan had shared. Voice notes, snippets of old recordings. It was as if the past had crawled back through the wires, whispering her sins. Daniel grew paranoid too. Their phones glitched, lights flickered, files disappeared. The company's headquarters even suffered a blackout during an investor call, a carefully timed strike orchestrated by Evan. The board began turning on Daniel. Investors fled completely. Lawsuits piled up. By the end of the month, Daniel's reputation was ruined, and Amelia's name was synonymous with deceit. But Evan wasn't done yet. He wanted the final act to happen face to face. And so he began preparing for it. Meticulously, he knew their habits, their roots, their weaknesses. Revenge, to Evan, wasn't about violence anymore. It was about exposure, about watching the guilty crumble under the weight of their own secrets. He just needed one perfect setup, one scene that would make them confess everything they'd buried. And he already knew where it would happen, the company's annual gala. A celebration of success built on the corpse of his career, that would be the stage. And they would be the performers in the final act of their own destruction. The invitation arrived just as Evan expected it would. Glossy black paper embossed with gold lettering, sealed in arrogance. TechVision Corp. Annual Celebration Gala, honoring innovation and leadership. At the bottom, in neat cursive print, hosted by Daniel Cross and Amelia Grant. Evan smirked. The irony was delicious. They were celebrating innovation built on his creation, and soon that very creation would destroy them. He placed the invitation on his desk, right beside the old company ID badge he'd kept, a relic of the man he used to be. The name Evan Cole still gleamed faintly under the flickering desk lamp. He touched the badge, whispering, "You're finally coming home." For days leading up to the gala, Evan moved like a phantom through the city, gathering, hacking, preparing. He had already infiltrated the company's internal network weeks ago, but this time he wasn't after data. He was after spectacle. He wanted their world to implode in front of everyone. He spent hours inside an abandoned office space on the outskirts of town, his new command center. The walls were covered with maps, photos, lines of code, and printed emails. At the center was a large monitor showing a live feed from the company's security cameras, which he had quietly tapped into. The gala was set to take place at the newly renovated Crescent Ballroom, the .RE, same venue where Daniel once proposed the merger that ended Evan's career. That night, it would become a stage for their humiliation. Evan didn't plan to attend as himself. That would be too obvious, too risky. Instead, he forged an identity, Logan Pierce, a supposed investor from a consulting firm. Fake credentials, real presence. He rented a tailored black suit, polished his shoes, and looked in the mirror. The man staring back wasn't the broken Evan Cole anymore. He was colder, sharper, a ghost reborn from betrayal. "Let's finish this," he muttered, straightening his tie. The night of the gala arrived under a curtain of rain. Rain. The city shimmered with reflections of neon lights as luxury cars lined up outside the grand ballroom. Inside, chandeliers glowed like captive suns, illuminating crystal tables and the faces of powerful people who had no idea they were about to witness the end of an empire. Evan entered through the side gate, his forged badge flashing under the scanner. The security guard nodded without suspicion. Inside, he blended perfectly, one of 100 polished guests with champagne glasses and practiced smiles. He scanned the room. Daniel stood near the stage, shaking hands with executives, his confident grin masking the exhaustion of the past few weeks. Amelia, in an elegant black gown, floated beside him, the same poise, the same charm that once disarmed Evan completely. But now he could see the cracks, her fake laughter, her glances of anxiety. They were breaking from the inside, and tonight he'd make sure everyone saw it. As the speeches began, Evan slipped away into a maintenance corridor leading to the control room. He moved with the precision of a surgeon, calm, deliberate. Inside, the air buzzed with the hum of machines. The main system that controlled the lighting, screens, and sound stood before him like an altar. He connected his encrypted drive and typed a few commands. The files began to upload videos, recordings, and documents he had gathered over months. Evidence of how Daniel and Amelia had stolen his software, manipulated the board, and framed him for their fraud. He had timed everything perfectly. At the height of Daniel's speech, the entire ballroom would become his confession booth. He glanced at the timer on his screen. 15 minutes until the show. Tonight, we celebrate not just success, but resilience. We've faced challenges, yes, but through teamwork and vision, we've built something incredible. The audience applauded. Cameras flashed. Evan watched from the edge of the crowd, his heart steady but his mind razor-sharp. Then Daniel's speech shifted, words filled with the same false humility that had fooled everyone years ago. I'd like to thank the people who made this journey possible, my incredible partner, Amelia, and our brilliant team. Evan's hand tightened around his glass. Your brilliant theft, you mean, he whispered. The timer on his phone reached 0, the lights flickered, once, twice, then every screen in the black. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Daniel froze mid-sentence, glancing toward the technicians in confusion. Then the screens came alive. At first it was just the company logo, then static, and finally a video. Evan's voice echoed through the hall, calm and cold. Good evening, everyone. Tonight's presentation is brought to you by the man they erased. Gasps filled the room. Amelia's eyes widened. Daniel's smile vanished. On the screens, emails appeared, real emails between Amelia and Daniel discussing how they'd framed Evan, how they manipulated data, how they divided his shares after forcing him out. Then came the recordings, Daniel's voice boasting to investors, Amelia's quiet laughter in the background. The crowd erupted in shock, board members stared in disbelief, reporters scrambled to record every second. Evan stood among them, expression unreadable, as the empire he'd built on trust turned to ash around its thieves. Amelia stumbled back, pale as paper. Daniel tried to shout over the chaos, his voice cracking, "Ew, this is fake! Someone's trying to sabotage us." But before he could finish, another clip played Daniel's recorded call with a rival firm admitting the theft. His words rang through the speakers like a confession from hell. Yeah, it was Cole's code. But he's gone now. He'll never prove it. The room went silent. Amelia looked at him in horror. For the first time, she realized the full weight of their crime and that the man they buried was now resurrected before them. Security rushed toward the control room. Evan knew they'd trace the signal soon. Calmly, he slipped through the side exit, removing his earpiece as the chaos behind him erupted into a storm of shouts, flashes, and panic. Outside, the rain poured heavier. He walked through it slowly, letting the water wash over his face like baptism. Inside the building, his ghost still haunted the screens. The presentation ended with a single line flashing in white letters against a black background. "Now you took everything from me. Now I take everything from you. Now I take everything from you." The next morning, every major news outlet carried the story. TechVision executives exposed in corporate fraud scandal, Amelia Grant and Daniel Cross under federal investigation. Their faces, once symbols of innovation, now plastered across headlines as symbols of disgrace. Evan watched from a quiet cafe, sipping black coffee as the anchor spoke his revenge into existence. No one knew who had leaked the files. The world only knew that justice had struck like lightning from a clear sky. But to Evan, this was more than justice. It was balance restored. Still, a small part of him, the part that once loved Amelia, detached as he saw her breaking down during an interview clip, denying everything, her eyes red from sleepless nights. He whispered softly, "You chose your side." He closed his laptop, left a few bills on the table, and walked out into the morning mist. His revenge was complete, his name was clean, his enemies were ruined. But peace still eluded him. Because once you become the ghost in someone else's story, you can never return to being human again. Half days after the gala, for weeks of the Capsadesh. For weeks after the gala, Evan lived like a man walking between two worlds, one of silence, and one that burned with the echo of what he'd done. Everywhere he turned, the headlines followed him like ghosts of victory. TechVision collapses after massive data leak. FBI confirms investigation into Amelia Grant and Daniel Cross. Anonymous whistleblower destroys corporate power duo. It was everything he had dreamed of, yet when he looked at those flashing screens, he didn't feel satisfaction. He felt something colder, something emptier. Revenge, he realized, doesn't end when your enemies fall. It lingers like smoke after a fire, poisoning the air you breathe. He had moved into a small apartment near the city's edge, just enough space for his computer, like a mattress and silence. The kind of place where nobody asked questions, where nobody cared who you were or what ghosts you carried. Every night he stared at the city lights through the window, listening to the hum of traffic below. For months that city had ignored his suffering, but now it whispered his triumph, yet the whispers brought no peace. He hadn't expected the nightmares, faces, screams, the flicker of Amelia's eyes when she realized who had destroyed her. The shock on Daniel's face as his empire burned before him. They haunted him, not out of guilt, but because somewhere deep inside, he realized he'd become part of the same darkness that once consumed them. Then came the letter. It arrived without a return address, just a plain envelope slipped under his door. Inside, a single photo, a photo of him taken from across the street. The caption below read in red ink, "Oh, did it feel good?" Evan froze. His pulse quickened, his fingers tightening around the paper. He rushed to the window, but the street below was empty. No figures, no movement, just rain sliding down the glass. He tore the photo in half and tossed it into the trash. But that night he couldn't sleep. The words echoed in his mind like a taunt. Did it feel good? The next few days grew strange. His laptop glitched once, a small flicker across the screen. Then again, the next night, a faint static noise in the speakers when no applications were running. Evan's instincts screamed that something was wrong. Someone was probing into his systems, carefully, quietly. But that was impossible. His setup was airtight, invisible to any trace. Still, paranoia crept in. Every time the phone rang, he hesitated. Every knock at the door made his heart race. Revenge had made him powerful. But it had also made him visible. One evening, while scanning through his security feeds, he froze. There, on camera, a figure standing outside the building entrance wearing a dark hood, just standing, watching. The image was grainy, but the stillness was unmistakable. The figure didn't move for several minutes. Then, without warning, turned and disappeared into the rain. Evan checked the timestamp, San Shar A.M. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the news broke again, another twist in the story that once defined his vengeance. Amelia Grant found dead in suspected suicide. Evan's breath caught in his throat. He turned up the TV volume as the reporter spoke in grim tones. Authorities have confirmed that Amelia Grant, former executive of TechVision Corp., was found deceased in her apartment late last night. Sources suggest the cause of death was suicide, though the investigation is ongoing. Grant had been under severe stress following recent scandals involving corporate misconduct. Evan sank into his chair, the world spinning around him. He'd wanted her to suffer, yes, to feel the weight of betrayal, but death? That wasn't part of his plan. He felt no triumph, no vindication, only a dull ache like a wound reopening. That night, he opened a bottle of whiskey and stared at the reflection of his monitor. For months, he had dreamed of seeing Amelia and Daniel ruined. But now that one of them was gone, the revenge felt meaningless. He whispered to himself, "You took everything from me, and I took everything from you. Now what?" Silence answered. But silence didn't last. 2 days later, while reviewing his system logs, Evan found something disturbing. An intrusion attempt, sophisticated and precise. Whoever was behind it knew what they were doing. He followed the digital trail through layers of encryption until he reached the source. It wasn't random. It came from Daniel's private server. That made no sense. Daniel's company was gone under investigation. The man should have been finished, unless he was coming back. Evan's hands moved fast over the keyboard, tracing signals, decrypting packets, diving deeper into the digital maze. Then suddenly a message popped up on his screen. "You thought you won, but I'm still here. Here." For a moment, Evan froze. Then his phone buzzed. An unknown number, a single text. Did it feel good watching her die? He stared at the message until the letters blurred, his throat tightened. The walls around him felt smaller, the air heavier. Daniel. It had to be him, but how? How had he survived the wreckage? How did he know where Evan was? Unless Daniel had found Amelia before her death. Unless this wasn't suicide at all. Evan went back to the files, the footage from Amelia's building. Using contacts from the dark web, he acquired surveillance archives from the night she died. Hours of footage. Nothing unusual until sure PM a figure entered through the side door, wearing a dark coat and hood. Amelia was still alive then. He could see her silhouette pacing near the window. Then, static. When the feed returned, she was gone. The figure too. The clock showed JURCA.M. Evan leaned back, staring at the monitor in disbelief. He knew that stance, that walk. It was Daniel. The realization hit like a wave of ice. Daniel hadn't just survived, he'd snapped. Dieting for Dankshan, he'd snapped. And now he was hunting the man who took everything from him. Evan's revenge had awoken something monstrous, and now the hunter had become the prey. For days, Evan stayed inside, barely sleeping, barely eating. He reinforced his systems, switched devices, even changed apartments. But no matter what he did, messages kept finding him. You created this. She died because of you. Now it's your turn. He tried to track the source, but the signals bounced endlessly. Daniel had learned well. Maybe too well. Every camera he passed felt like an eye. Every shadow, a threat. The ghost he had created in the wires had multiplied. Then came the final message, the one that ended his silence. An email, no sender. Subject mate where it started, subject meet me where it started, attachment, a single photo, the old TechVision building, and a time, midnight. Evan stared at the screen, his reflection staring back, hollow eyes, trembling hands. He could ignore it. Run. Hide. Start over, but something deep inside whispered that there was no escape from this, not until one of them was gone for good. He shut his laptop, put on his coat, and whispered into the dark. Let's finish it. The night was cold. The building stood abandoned, wrapped in silence and shadows. Evan stepped inside, flashlight cutting through the dust and decay. He made his way to top floor. He made his way to the top floor, his old office, the place where his life had ended and his revenge had begun. And there, sitting in the same chair where Evan once sat, was Daniel Raylive, hollow-eyed, smiling. Been a while, Daniel said softly. Evan didn't answer. The air between them was thick with years of hatred. Daniel stood slowly, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and madness. You ruined me. You think you won? She's dead because of you. Evan's jaw tightened. She was already dead the day she betrayed me. Daniel laughed, a cold, empty sound. Then let's see which one of us dies next. He reached into his coat. Evan lunged. The struggle was fast, violent, desperate. Years of rage exploded into seconds of chaos. The flashlight fell, rolling across the floor. Shadows danced wildly as fists met flesh, rage met consequence. Then, a gunshot. Silence. Evan staggered back, breath ragged, staring down at Daniel. Bleeding, motionless. He dropped the gun, trembling. It was over. Finally over. But as he looked at Daniel's lifeless body, the realization hit him like a curse. He had become the very monster he once sought to destroy. He walked out into the rain, leaving everything behind, the building, the gun, the ghosts. No headlines would carry his name, no one would ever know what really happened. And that was fine, because vengeance, he finally understood, wasn't about justice, it was about destruction. And in the end, it destroys everyone. The town woke that morning to a whisper that carried through diners, churches, and every corner of the quiet New Hampshire Valley. Pastor Raymond's church. It's under investigation. No one knew where it began, maybe from the police station, or maybe from the newsroom. But by noon, it had spread like wildfire. Ethan sat in his car across from the church, watching people gather at the gates. He'd been up all night, his mind razor sharp, his heart colder than stone. For years, Raymond had stood at that pulpit, speaking of purity, family, and God's will. But today, the saint was about to fall, and Ethan was holding the match. The night before, everything had unfolded according to his design. Ethan had spent weeks crafting a web of evidence, precise, believable, impossible to dismiss. It began with the financial records he'd planted in Raymond's office computer. Emails showing charity donations rerouted to private accounts. Receipts for lavish purchases, jewelry, hotel stays, even a second phone bill under a different name, but that wasn't enough. Ethan wanted the world to see the monster behind the pulpit. He had found old footage, community fundraisers, youth group events, interviews. In every clip, Raymond looked charismatic and fatherly. But with subtle editing, Ethan turned those same clips into something disturbing. Moments where Raymond's eyes lingered too long, where his hands brushed too familiarly, where his smile twisted into something. The illusion was perfect. He didn't fabricate lies, he amplified truths, just enough to make the devil peek through the angel's mask. By R8M, he had sent everything, the documents, the footage, the anonymous letters to every local journalist, donor and board member associated with the church. The subject line was simple. You deserve to know the man behind the pulpit. Then he waited. Now sitting in his car as police cruisers pulled up to the church steps, Ethan felt no joy. Just silence. Detective Carla Monroe exited her car, the same woman who once investigated Ethan's supposed crash. She looked tired but alert. Reporters surrounded her instantly, shouting questions about corruption and misconduct. Raymond came out moments later, his face pale, suit immaculate, smile trembling. He tried to calm the crowd, but the noise drowned him. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Parishioners gasped as officers entered the building behind him. Ethan could almost hear the man's heart cracking under the pressure. The image was beautiful, poetic even. Later that afternoon, Ethan visited his father's old grave again. The stone was cool under his palm. "They finally see him now," he whispered. "The wolf in the robe." He placed a single white rose on the ground, not for his father, but for the boy he used to be. The one who believed that truth always won on its own. But truth, Ethan had learned, needed help. It needed claws. The next few days were chaos. News stations replayed Raymond's edited footage with damning commentary. The church suspended him pending investigation. Donations froze. His wife Martha left the parsonage with their children and stayed with relatives. Ethan followed it all quietly, never gloating, never posting, just watching as Raymond's life crumbled. Then one night a black SUV pulled up outside Ethan's house. He knew that sound, the low hum of an engine that didn't belong to any neighbor. He turned off his lights and waited. A knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps. Ethan opened it slowly. There stood Raymond, but not the polished pastor. This Raymond was disheveled, eyes bloodshot, tie gone, hands shaking. "Akandafta nada tian tracta. You think I don't know it's you?" Raymond's voice was low, trembling with fury. "You think I wouldn't recognize your handiwork, Ethan? You always had your father's arrogance." Ethan stared at him, calm and unflinching. "I have his sense of justice," Raymond's lip curled. "You ruined me. You destroyed my family, my church. You destroyed my father." For a moment, silence filled the doorway. The weight of it pressed between them like a ghost. Raymond's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt, quickly buried under rage. "Your father was weak. He couldn't handle the responsibility. He made mistakes." "No," Ethan said quietly. "You made sure he paid for yours." Raymond's eyes darkened. "You think anyone will believe you when this settles? You think you can erase me?" "I'll rebuild. I always do. A Turner Cheffen Sermafen. I always do." Ethan smiled faintly. "You can't rebuild ashes, Raymond." Raymond took a step forward, but Ethan didn't move. The older man's breath was heavy, his composure fracturing with every passing second. Paviskins beckoned. Finally, he spat on the floor and turned away, stumbling into the night. Ethan closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his heart pounding. He had faced the devil and lived. But he knew this wasn't over yet, because men like Raymond didn't fall quietly. They dragged everything down with them. The next morning, Ethan woke to a voicemail. "Mr. Blake, this is Detective Monroe. We've received some concerning information. It appears Pastor Raymond has filed a report against you, claims you've been stalking and threatening him. I need you to come down to the station today." Ethan sat back, exhaling slowly. Of course, the pastor wasn't done fighting, but Ethan wasn't afraid, because the next phase of his plan had already begun. He had one last card to play, one that would bury Raymond not just in scandal, but in truth. The truth Raymond had buried with his father. Ethan opened his laptop, typing in a string of numbers, an encrypted password only he knew. A folder opened on his screen titled The Confession. Inside it was a Tuvanti, his father's last sermon, the one that was never aired. The night before he died, Daniel Blake had recorded it privately in the church, and Ethan had found it years later on an old drive hidden behind a loose brick in the house. He pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room, trembling, heartbroken. "If I die, let it be known that the truth was twisted. The numbers they claim I falsified, they were transferred under orders. Orders from a man I trusted with my soul." Ethan closed his eyes. His father had named him Raymond Cole. That night, the town's largest news outlet received an anonymous email. Attached was the recording, time-stamped, authenticated, and verified. By dawn, the headline blazed across every screen. "Leaked audio exposes pastor's role in church fraud scandals." Raymond's image, the polished, God-fearing leader, shattered completely. Ethan watched from his porch as reporters swarmed Raymond's property, as the church board publicly denounced him, as his name became synonymous with greed and deceit. This time, no lies could save him. This time, it was over. In the silence that followed, Ethan sat back and let the world spin. For the first time in years, he felt peace, not happiness, not triumph, but peace. He'd carried his father's ghost long enough. Now the man who buried Daniel Blake was buried by his own sins, Kefir, and Ethan, the son who'd once stood in the shadows, had finally stepped into the light. The sky was gray that morning, the kind of gray that swallows sound. Cold rain tapped gently on the roof of Ethan's house as he sat by the window. ate a cup of black coffee untouched beside him. The world outside felt still, too still, like the calm after a storm that had devoured everything in its path. On the small television across the room, the headline looped for the third straight day, former Pastor Raymond Colander. The footage showed Raymond in handcuffs, escorted by federal agents through a crowd of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, questions hurled like stones, but the once smooth pastor didn't look at them. He looked broken, his eyes hollow, his jaw trembling, his soul gone. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but pity. Because for the first time, he wasn't looking at the monster who destroyed his father. He was looking at a man who had finally been crushed by his own sins. Over the next week, the town of Maple Hollow began to change. The church was closed pending reorganization. Parishioners gathered in small prayer groups, some grieving, some furious. Donations stopped, faith fractured. Detective Carla Monroe paid Ethan a visit, not as an investigator this time, but as a quiet observer of what remained. "You really did it," she said softly, looking around his living room. "The evidence, the recordings, it all checked out. Everything he accused you of was false." Ethan didn't look up from the window. It wasn't about proving innocence. It was about truth. She nodded, hesitated, then asked, "And now that you've got it?" Ethan finally turned toward her. His eyes were calm, unreadable. Harriet Monroe studied him for a moment. There was something in his tone, a kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but something close. "You know," she said quietly, "you could have handed all this over years ago. You could have let the law handle it." "I tried," Ethan replied, "but the law only sees what it's shown. Raymond controlled what they saw. I just changed the picture." She exhaled slowly, realizing there was nothing left to say. She handed him her card anyway. "If you ever need to talk." Ethan smiled faintly. "Talking doesn't bring the dead back, detective." When she left, the house fell silent again, the kind of silence that echoes. Days passed, then weeks. And for the first time in years, Ethan began to live. He repaired the old barn behind the house, started tending to the small garden his father once planted. Every morning he'd brew coffee, sit outside and listen to the world waking up, birds, wind, and the distant hum of life moving on. But even as peace settled in, something within him remained restless. Because revenge, no matter how righteous, doesn't fill the emptiness. It just quiets it for a while. Then one evening, as he was organizing his father's old belongings, Ethan found something unexpected. A small, dust-covered cassette tape inside a faded envelope. On the front, written in his father's handwriting, were the words, "E for my son, to be played when the storm is over." Ethan's heart stopped. He took the tape, trembling, and slid it into an old player. The machine whirred, crackled, then came alive with his father's voice, soft, weary, but warm. "If you're hearing this, Ethan, then I suppose the truth has found its way out, one way or another. I need you to know, son, that I never meant for you to carry this burden. Revenge may feel like justice, but it's a poison that slowly replaces your soul. Promise me, when you find peace, truly find it, you'll let it go." Ethan sat in silence, his throat tightening. The tape continued, "Note, the men who wronged us will face their judgment, in this life or the next, but you still have time to live. Don't let my death be the reason you stop." The tape clicked softly, ending. For the first time since that night, the night the church took his father's name, his home, his youth, Ethan cried. Not out of pain this time, but release. He finally understood. This was never just about vengeance. It was about freedom from the shadow of hatred that Raymond had built. The next morning, Ethan drove into town. The streets looked the same, the diner on Main Street, the old gas station, the church in the distance, boarded up now and silent. He parked outside the church gates and stepped out. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of rain. He walked up to the doors, placed his hand against the wood, and whispered, "It's done." Then he turned away, leaving it behind forever. 2 months later, Ethan sat in a small recording studio in Boston. The sign outside read, Blake Audio Restoration. He had reopened his father's old passion project, restoring lost or damaged tapes for families who wanted to hear forgotten voices again. The work was quiet, meticulous, almost meditative. He'd listen to old stories, crackling laughter, final goodbyes, and in every voice, he found a piece of the world worth saving. One afternoon, while adjusting levels on a client's tape, his phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Disgraced Pastor Raymond Cole found dead in motel room, apparent suicide. Ethan froze. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he turned off the monitor, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. The man who had once seemed untouchable, who had stood above everyone, had finally fallen all the way down. There was no joy in it, only quiet inevitability. Ethan whispered to himself, "The storm's over, Dad." And with that, he pressed play on the next tape, a soft recording of a grandmother's lullaby. For the first time in years, his world sounded peaceful. It was a bright spring morning when Ethan returned to Maple Hollow. The town had changed, new faces, new signs, a new pastor leading services in the rebuilt chapel. The past had become history just as it should. Ethan visited the cemetery where two headstones now stood side by side, his father's, and newly placed, one for Raymond Cole. He set down 2 flowers, one white rose, one black lily. For forgiveness, he murmured, placing the white one on his father's grave. For memory, he said, placing the black one on Raymond's. Then he turned to leave. As he walked back toward his car, a soft wind swept through the valley, carrying the faint echo of a sermon, one that only existed in his memory now. Light always finds its way through the cracks, Ethan. You just have to stop looking for it in the dark. He smiled, not the smile of a man who'd won, but of one who'd finally stopped fighting. The revenge was complete, the wounds were healed, and somewhere Daniel Blake's spirit could finally rest. Ethan looked back one last time and whispered, "Rest easy, Dad. I did what I had to. But now, I'll live." He got in his car, started the engine, and drove away as sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the road ahead. The storm had passed, and for the first time, Ethan Blake was truly free. The months rolled on like slow-moving clouds. Summer came softly that year, warm breezes, long days, and the kind of quiet that felt almost sacred. Ethan had thought that chapter of his life was finally closed. But the past, as he would soon learn, never really ends. It lingers like an echo that refuses to fade. He was sitting in his small Boston studio one afternoon, cleaning an old reel-to-reel machine, when his assistant, a young woman named Claire, knocked on the door. "Mr. Blake, you've got a letter," she said, handing him a thick envelope. "No return address." Ethan frowned. He hadn't received handwritten mail in years. Most people didn't even know this address. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded note and a flash drive. The note read, "You may have won your father's war, but the battlefield is larger than you think." Play the file. Ethan's pulse quickened. For a moment, he just stared at the drive, a creeping unease spreading through him. Then, cautiously, he plugged it into his computer. The screen flickered, static at first, then a video began to play. It was grainy footage from what looked like a church basement. In the frame stood 3 men. One was Raymond Cole. The others were unfamiliar, men in suits, older, confident, their faces shadowed by the dim light. Ethan turned up the volume. "The money's handled," one of the men said. "But if Daniel keeps asking questions, we'll have to make it look like his mistake." "Raymond, you understand what that means?" Raymond nodded silently. The second man added, "The church's name can't be tied to this. The higher donors wouldn't like that. You take the fall quietly, or we find someone else who will." The video cut off abruptly. Ethan sat back, the air knocked out of him. There it was, proof that Raymond hadn't acted alone, that his father's destruction had been orchestrated by something bigger, a network of men hiding behind religion and reputation. He thought it was over, but this was only the surface. For the next few days, Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the footage, studying faces, voices, background details. On the desk beside the laptop lay the letter. The handwriting was precise, deliberate. Whoever sent it knew exactly what they were doing. By the 3rd day, Ethan decided to trace the source. He found a faint watermark in the corner of the note, an emblem that looked like a dove wrapped in thorns. He'd seen it before. On the official letterhead of the Foundation of Faith and Family, the organization that once funded Raymond's church. Ethan's jaw tightened. That foundation was the one responsible for most of the region's church finances. It was still operational. If what the video showed was true, then the corruption that destroyed his father had been deeper than anyone imagined. That night, Ethan drove 3 hours north, to Concord, where the Foundation kept its headquarters. The building was modern, all glass and steel, reflecting the night sky like a mirror. He sat in his car across the street, watching employees leave one by one. By midnight, only one window on the top floor remained lit. Ethan's pulse steadied. He wasn't there for violence, only truth. He waited another hour, then slipped into the building through a side door he'd scoped earlier that evening. His old skills in digital access and surveillance came back naturally. Within minutes, he reached the executive floor. So, inside a large office, documents were stacked in neat piles, financial ledgers displayed across the screen. Ethan scanned them quickly, charity funds rerouted, political donations disguised as community outreach, transfers to shell accounts. The same pattern that had destroyed his father's reputation. It wasn't Raymond who built this system. He was just the face. The men above him were the architects, and Ethan had their blueprints now. He spent the next week assembling everything. He cross-referenced old financial trails with the new ones, connecting the dots that others had ignored. Each night, he'd listen again to his father's old tape, his voice reminding him to let go, and each time, Ethan whispered back, "I will." After this, revenge had once been personal, now it was purpose. On the 10th night, Ethan received another letter, slipped under his studio door this time. No postage, no name. They know you're digging again. Stop before they stop you. He looked around the dark studio, feeling the hair on his neck rise. Someone had been close enough to leave this by hand. He checked the security cameras. The footage showed a shadowy figure at 8 a.m., hooded, moving with precision, avoiding every camera angle except one brief flash of light, a silver cross around their neck. Someone from inside the church network. Ethan realized the hunt had begun again. He didn't run. Instead, he did what he'd done best, turned the game around. He released a snippet of the basement footage anonymously online, sending copies to 3 journalists who had once covered Raymond's scandal. Within Ardersief hours, social media buzzed with speculation. The story reignited, whispers of a larger conspiracy, of financial corruption masked as faith-based charity. And behind it all, one familiar name kept resurfacing, the Foundation of Faith and Family. The board scrambled. Statements were issued, denials made, but the video was undeniable. And then suddenly another clip surfaced, not from Ethan but from someone else, a continuation of the original video. This time it showed the same 3 men counting envelopes of cash, with Raymond saying one line Ethan would never forget. "What about Daniel Blake? He's asking too many questions." One of the men replied coldly, "Then make him stop asking." The screen cut to black. The media erupted. The story wasn't about a fallen pastor anymore. It was about a decades-long corruption ring stretching through churches, charities, and political donors. Federal agents reopened the old investigation, not into Daniel Blake, but into everyone who had framed him. And for the first time, Ethan didn't need to manipulate a thing. The truth carried itself. Weeks later, Ethan received one last message. No name, no traceable sender. "You did what we couldn't. The system's eating itself now. Your father would be proud. A friend he never discovered who a friend was. Maybe a journalist, maybe an insider, maybe someone who once believed in Raymond's cause and wanted to cleanse it. It didn't matter. The circle was complete. Months passed. Ethan returned to Maple Hollow one final time. This time not for revenge, but for closure. The new pastor had rebuilt the church with honesty and transparency. The congregation had grown smaller, but purer. Ethan attended a Sunday service quietly, sitting in the last pew. He didn't pray, he just listened. When the sermon ended, the pastor spoke of forgiveness, how it doesn't mean forgetting, but freeing yourself from the weight of the wound. Ethan smiled faintly. He understood that now, after the service, he stepped outside. The sun was bright, golden light spilling over the valley. He pulled out his phone, opened the folder labeled Father, and hit delete. All of it, the tapes, the files, the evidence gone, because justice had been done, and the rest no longer belonged to him. And then to Rabens Amer Rechten Teen Tun Trekken Sisiften. That night he wrote one final letter, not to Raymond, not to the church, but to his father. He placed it on the grave the next morning. "Kino Dad, I fought your battle, and I won, but I realized something. Revenge didn't heal me. It just showed me how deep love can turn when it's left to burn in silence. The men who wronged you paid their price, but now I let it go. I'm done with ghosts, Ethan." He stood there for a long moment, watching the sun climb higher, feeling the last traces of the past dissolve into the wind. Then he turned and walked away, no longer the son of a fallen man, but the man who rose to end the fall. The storm was truly over, and as he disappeared into the morning light, a soft whisper seemed to drift through the trees, the echo of a father's voice, proud and at peace. The city was asleep, but in a dimly lit room, Sarah was very much awake. Her eyes reflected the cold glow of her laptop screen, lines of code scrolling like digital whispers of vengeance. For weeks she had been preparing for this moment, collecting evidence, tracing hidden transactions, and mapping every secret Ethan thought he had buried. After his empire crumbled and his mistress abandoned him, Ethan believed the storm was finally over. He had started rebuilding small deals, small promises, trying to convince investors he was still the man he once was, but he didn't know that every call he made, every email he sent, every desperate attempt to recover was being monitored by Sarah. She had become the ghost in his system. Through an anonymous digital identity she created, she infiltrated Ethan's private accounts, intercepted his communications, and even mirrored his bank activity. The irony was cruel. She was using the same tricks Ethan had once used to manipulate her during their marriage. Only this time she was the one pulling the strings. One night she leaned back in her chair and whispered to herself, this is it. On her screen was a fake investment proposal, a perfectly crafted offer from a supposed European financier. All the right legal language, all the right contacts, and a promise of a multi-million-dollar deal. Ethan, desperate to reclaim his fortune, Kat would never resist such bait. She smiled faintly. Vashalam, let's see how greedy you still are. Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, empty bottles on the table, his reflection in the window looking hollow and worn. His phone buzzed. It was the email, Dear Mr. Ethan Cross, right? We have reviewed your credentials and are prepared to invest Ardent Wu Million in your new venture. His heart pounded after months of humiliation and failure. This looked like salvation. He didn't notice the hidden digital fingerprint embedded in the document. He didn't notice that the virtual meeting link led to Sarah's encrypted server. He didn't notice that the very hope he was clinging to was the rope she was tightening around his neck. He spent the next week obsessed, drafting contracts, exchanging messages, dreaming of being powerful again. He told his few remaining allies that a massive deal was on the way, that soon everything would change. And indeed, everything would change. When the signing day came, Sarah watched from her home office. Her screen split between live CCTV feeds and email logs. She had hired a small team of ethical hackers, paid in crypto, no questions asked. Together, they were about to dismantle Ethan's entire financial illusion. At precisely Ling AM, Ethan joined the virtual call. The investors appeared, 3 faces, deep-voiced, professional, AI-generated avatars coded by Sarah's team. The meeting lasted 30 minutes. By the end, Ethan had signed the deal digitally, unknowingly transferring all his remaining assets, his hidden accounts, properties, and shares into a holding company that didn't exist. Sarah clicked execute. Within seconds, the data cascaded, his passwords reset, his crypto wallets drained, his properties flagged for investigation under his name. By the time he realized what happened, it was too late. The empire he tried to rebuild had vanished, swallowed whole by the illusion of greed. That night, Sarah sat in silence. The screens around her flickered with confirmation messages, transactions completed, accounts frozen, and one final message flashing at the bottom of her monitor, operation completed successfully. But she didn't smile, not yet. This wasn't about money, this was about truth. The world still thought Ethan was a victim of bad luck, a man ruined by unfortunate business deals. But Sarah knew the only way to end this was to let the world see him as he truly was. She opened a hidden folder titled Phase R. Inside were recorded phone calls, mails, and medios mass, and amitos of videos, and documents, every dark secret Ethan ever tried to bury. She hovered her mouse over the upload button. Her voice was steady, quiet, and resolute. You destroyed my life in public, Ethan. Now I'll return the favor. And with a single click, the trap was complete. The morning after the deal, the city woke up to chaos. But for Ethan, it started with silence. A heavy, unnatural kind of silence, the kind that comes before something terrible. He reached for his phone out of habit, no signal. He tried to open his laptop. His accounts were locked. His fingers trembled as he refreshed the browser again and again. But every page showed the same brutal message. Access denied. Activity detect. A cold sweat broke down his neck. He opened his email, hoping for an explanation. And that's when the first headline hit his screen. Business tycoon Ethan Cross under investigation for fraud. His heart sank. There were screenshots, leaked documents, and video clips of phone calls, his voice, his words talking about bribes, hidden transfers, and illegal deals. It was all real. Every single thing he had done in secret was now public. The tried deck and Prambada, mud in the sastic. He tried calling his lawyer, no answer. He tried his assistant, phone switched off. He stormed out of his apartment, and for the first time in years, the doorman avoided his eyes. Out on the street, photographers swarmed him like vultures. Their cameras flashed like gunfire, their voices slicing through the morning air. Now, Mr. Cross, is it true you faked the European deal? Did you steal from your investors? Who leaked the files, Ethan? Was it your wife? The last question hit him like a bullet. His wife, Sarah. He hadn't thought about her in months, not since the divorce, not since he'd told her she was too weak to survive without him. But now something inside him twisted a feeling he couldn't name fear. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quiet apartment. Her screens glowed softly in the dark, not each showing a different news network. Every anchor said his name. Every channel replayed his voice, his lies, his crimes. It was done. The world saw Ethan Cross not as a genius, but as a thief, a manipulator, a man whose empire was built on broken people. Sarah didn't cry. There was nothing left to cry for. She just watched, calm, steady, focused, like a surgeon observing the success of a delicate operation. The revenge wasn't fueled by rage anymore. It was precision. It was justice, the kind the courts had failed to give her. But even as she watched him burn, there was something she couldn't ignore. A growing emptiness. Emptiness. Revenge gives you purpose, but once it's complete, it leaves you hollow. And yet, she wasn't done. By nightfall, Ethan's world had collapsed. His accounts were frozen. His name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Mayfas. Investors withdrew their funds. Friends blocked his number, And his mistress, the one who once swore she'd stand by him, disleveled every trace of their relationship online. He spent hours pacing his apartment, like every reflection of himself in the mirror, a reminder of what he'd lost. But then he noticed something strange. An email, no subject line, no sender name. Just one word in the body, enjoying the view. His pulse spiked. He replied instantly, "Who is this?" "Nope." He waited, and then another message appeared. "You took everything from me, Ethan. Now you'll understand what it feels like to lose control." He froze. The voice in his head whispered the name he had been avoiding. Sarah. For the first time since the scandal broke, his fear turned into panic. He tore through old files, dissolved folders, burned papers, anything that it could trace back to her. But it was too late. The trap wasn't just financial, it was psychological. She had crawled under his skin, turned every shadow into suspicion, every silence into a threat. He began to see her everywhere, in the news, in the headlines, in the quiet hum of his phone late at night. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat, he couldn't think without hearing her voice echoing in his head. "You destroyed my life in public, Ethan. Now I'll return the favor." The next week was worse. Ethan was summoned for questioning. Reporters hounded him at every turn. His investors sued him for fraud. The empire he once bragged about was now a smoking ruin. He looked at himself in the mirror one night, unshaven, broken, desperate, and whispered, "Why didn't she just let me go?" But Sarah wasn't done letting go. Not yet. The public humiliation was only the first half. Because her next move wouldn't just ruin his name, it would crush his soul. The city had moved on. The headlines had faded, but Ethan Cross hadn't. His name still lingered like smoke after a fire, a reminder of how quickly power could vanish. He had lost everything, his company, his friends, his reputation, but the one thing he couldn't lose was the guilt gnawing inside him. Every night he sat in the dim light of his apartment, staring at the flickering TV, waiting for it to show something other than his failure. But the silence was cruel, because in that silence he could almost hear her, Sarah. He hadn't seen her since the divorce. He had convinced himself she'd moved away, found somewhere far from his shadow. But that anonymous email, that cold, calculated voice, had shattered that illusion. Now every creak of the floor, every buzz from his phone felt like her presence crawling back into his life. He tried to fight it, to tell himself she couldn't have done this alone. Maybe it was the press, maybe a hacker, maybe anyone but her, but deep down he knew, or only Sarah knew him well enough, to destroy him this completely. One morning, a letter slid under his door. A real one, no email, no text, just paper. His name was written in her handwriting, elegant, calm, deliberate. He froze before opening it. His breath caught between dread and curiosity. Inside, there was no apology, no accusation, just a photograph. It showed Sarah standing in front of their old house, the one he had forced her to sell when his business was collapsing. She was smiling. In her hand was a key, the old house key, and beneath the photo, a line written in ink, "Fi fall fom bashnashrel sabana." Come home, Ethan, one last time. That night he drove out of the city. The air was heavy, the sky the color of wet ashes. The further he drove, the quieter the world became, as if the noise of his ruined life couldn't follow him out there. The house stood at the edge of the woods, exactly as he remembered, paint peeling, windows, fog, and yet hauntingly familiar. The porch creaked beneath his steps. He pushed open the door. The hinges groaned like an old memory refusing to die. Inside, everything was just as they'd left it, the dusty furniture, the faint smell of rain on wood, and the echo of a life that used to be whole. He stepped into the living room. On the table lay another note. "Do you remember what you said the night you left?" He frowned. His mind scrambled through the fog of memory. Then it came, that night he'd walked out suitcase in hand, Sarah crying behind him, and he'd turned cold and cruel, saying, "You'll never survive without me." He gritted his teeth. Now standing there surrounded by silence, he whispered to the empty house, "Looks like you proved me wrong." But the house didn't answer. Only the wind through broken glass, a hollow, whispering sound, coot-like laughter in the dark. He wandered deeper inside, following faint light from the kitchen. The table was set, 2 plates, 2 glasses, a half-empty bottle of wine. His heart pounded. Was she here? Was she here? Had she been waiting for him? Then he noticed the small black recorder on the table. He pressed play. Sarah's voice filled the room. "You took everything from me, Ethan, my love, my home, my dignity. You turned my life into your control experiment. But here's the thing about control. When you lose it, it destroys you from the inside." Her voice was calm, almost tender, like a lullaby twisted into a confession. "Do you know why I called you back here?" she continued. "Because this house is where it all began and where it should end." The message clicked off, silence again. He looked around, the room seemed to close in on him, the memories pressing down like walls. He stumbled into the hallway, calling her name now. "Sarah, where are you?" But his voice cracked under the weight of fear. He pushed open the bedroom door. Inside, photos, hundreds of them. Pinned to the walls, the mirror, the dresser, every one of them was him. Laughing, smiling, speaking on stages, shaking hands with politicians, the man he used to be. And in red ink written across them, "Who are you?" He backed away, breathing fast. Then his eyes fell on the dresser. Another envelope. He opened it with shaking hands. "You ruined my life so you could feel powerful. Now you'll live what you gave me: isolation, humiliation, and fear. The police will arrive soon. You'll be found here, surrounded by your lies." He didn't understand. Then he heard it, the faint wail of sirens in the distance. She'd tipped them off. She'd led him straight into his own undoing. Ethan panicked, rushing to the window, and that's when he saw her, standing under the streetlight, rain soaking her coat, face calm, eyes unblinking. Sarah, their eyes met through the glass. And in that moment, he saw no hatred, just finality, the end of a storm she had weathered for too long. He pressed his hand to the glass, but she didn't move, didn't smile, didn't even blink. Then the sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flashed across the old house walls, and when he turned back toward the street, she was gone. Minutes later, the police broke down the door. They found Ethan surrounded by papers, evidence, and broken pride. His fingerprints were everywhere. The charges waiting for him, undeniable. But more than that, they found a man finally trapped in the same cage he once built for someone else. And somewhere miles away, Sarah sat in a quiet diner, watching the news on a small TV in the corner. Former CEO Ethan Kross arrested for fraud, extortion, and witness tampering. She stirred her coffee, her reflection calm, almost peaceful. Revenge, she realized, it wasn't about destruction. It was about balance, restoring what had been stolen. Eat. And finally, breathing again. The news spread fast. By dawn, every major network was replaying the footage. Ethan Kross, handcuffed, head bowed, being escorted out of his old suburban home. Reporters swarmed like vultures. Microphones thrust forward, voices overlapping in a storm of questions. "Mr. Kross, do you admit to the charges? What do you have to say about the leaked recordings? Or who exposed your crimes?" But Ethan said nothing. He didn't even lift his head. For the first time in his life, silence was his only defense. Far away, Sarah watched from her small apartment, the morning light filtering through thin curtains. The world outside went on as usual. Cars passing, people walking, life continuing as if nothing had happened. On the TV screen, Ethan's image flickered. The man who had once believed himself untouchable, now reduced to a hollow reflection of his arrogance. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't cry either. She just watched, and when the news anchor moved on to another story, she turned off the TV and sat in silence. The revenge was complete. The empire he'd built on deceit and pride was gone. The man who once claimed she couldn't live without him was now the one begging for mercy. And yet, the room still felt empty. Revenge, she realized, is never truly about the other person. It's about the part of yourself they broke, the wound you spend years trying to heal, until you realize the only way forward is to bleed the poison out. Sarah had done that. She had poured years of pain into her plan, co-woven every sleepless night into a tapestry of justice. And now, as the dust settled, she found herself in the strangest place of all, Freedom. Now, not the kind that comes with laughter or celebration, but the quiet kind, the kind that whispers instead of shouts. A few days later, she visited the old house one last time. It was taped off by the police, but she stood outside the gate, watching the wind stir through the empty porch. This place had witnessed their love, their lies, and their downfall. She remembered the nights they'd sat on that porch, dreaming of a future together. Back then, she had believed him, believed that love could survive anything, but love without respect, she had learned, was just another form of control. She took a slow breath and whispered, almost to herself, now. And for the first time in years, she meant it. Meanwhile, in a gray cell 2 states away, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his mind unraveling in slow, merciless loops. He kept seeing her face that night, not angry, not triumphant, just still. The silence between them had been the loudest punishment of all. He'd expected her to gloat, to scream, to make him feel small, but instead she had left him alone with his thoughts. And that silence was worse than any sentence the law could give. He realized too late that Sarah hadn't destroyed him out of hatred, she had destroyed him out of understanding. Now whereas no one knew his weaknesses, pad denforis 100 for captor rancicid pandem persis. No one freteris she'd, because no one knew his weaknesses better than she did. No one knew how to make him face himself, and that, he thought, was the cruelest part of all. Months passed, the world forgot Ethan Cross. His name faded from the headlines, his company dismantled, his assets divided and sold. Sarah, meanwhile, started over quietly. She moved to a small town by the coast to taught art classes to children, and painted again for the first time in years. Sometimes she'd look at the sea, the endless, shifting gray, and think about how revenge is like the tide. It comes in violent waves and crashes hard against the shore, and then it pulls back, leaving only silence behind. That silence, she had learned, was not emptiness, it was peace. One evening, as the sun dipped into the ocean, a stranger approached her after class. He was carrying a newspaper. She recognized the logo immediately, the same publication that had broken Ethan's scandal months ago. "Are you Sarah Cross?" he asked gently. She paused. The name sounded strange now, like something from another lifetime. "I was," she said softly. He nodded, unfolding the paper. "They're closing the case," he said. "Ethan took a plea deal. He'll be serving 20 years. Sarah nodded. There was no satisfaction in her expression. Just acceptance. "Thank you," she said simply, and turned back toward the sea. That night she stood by the window, watching the reflection of the moon dance across the waves. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and rain, and for a moment, she thought she heard his voice, the echo of their past lives. "You'll never survive without me," she smiled faintly. "I already did," she whispered. And in that whisper there was both an ending and a beginning, because revenge in its truest form was never about destroying the other person. It was about reclaiming yourself. In the end, Sarah didn't win because she ruined Ethan's life. She won because she got hers back. The world may never know her story. No headlines, no interviews, no triumphant confessions. Just a quiet woman by the sea, painting in the fading light, her heart finally still. But somewhere, deep inside her, she knew the truth, and that was enough. Because peace is the most expensive kind of revenge, and she had finally paid in full.